Back on Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold, who serves as chair of the Democratic Secretaries of State of the United States. So, Secretary Griswold, nice to see you again. We chatted, I think, when the 14th Amendment case was going on, and maybe one other time as well. But here we are, about 30 days out from the election, and I wanted to chat with you about concerns that you and fellow Secretary of States have about voter integrity, the protection of our election workers, and everything. So, thanks for being on.
Of course. Thanks for having me on, Dean.
Sure. So, look, let me just ask you right from the outset here. Just 2 days ago, JD Vance said Trump won the 2020 election. The debate, he wouldn't say one way or the other. Then he said to their comedy team, but they're, I know them, Jason Selvig, the good liars. But he said, nope, Trump won. And you have Donald Trump saying point blank over and over, I can only lose if there is fraud. So we've lived through this, and we're living through a scary Groundhog Day. What do these red flags what does this do for you in terms of red flag raising when he says, I can only
Yeah.
lose if there's fraud?
Yeah. Well, it just underlines that Trump and his allies remain an existential threat to American democracy. Elections work when and they result in a winner and a loser. And only accepting results if you lose is just not how the system works. It's undemocratic. It just shows his lack of character and his inability within himself to accept that he lost the presidency last cycle. But his lies and misinformation do more. They're more than just words. They're being used to destabilize the whole system.
I agree with you. And they're deeply alarming because, again, we lived through this. It's not like we're in a vacuum. We're like, oh, I wonder where this can go. We know where this can go. We know what January 6th can happen. We know other
Yeah.
criminality. People are charged with crimes across the nation for being involved in his scheme. So, from the point of view as a Secretary of State in Colorado, what are you doing in terms of addressing voter integrity issues and security, ensuring the poll workers
Yeah.
are going to be safe?
I'm absolutely going to answer that question, but to delve a little further into your initial question, Trump's words incite action, and he well knows that at this point. So we've seen the big lie spouted from him and continued up until today be used to justify voter suppression laws, incite insider threats and attacks on our election infrastructure, and be a basis to the threats that election workers have been receiving. And to be very clear, he is lying so that he can blame a potential loss on his conspiracies rather than accept the American people just don't like him enough to be president again. And twice in September, he's spouting lies and even going so far as to threaten election workers. He basically said in September that if he wins, he's going to go after election workers to prosecute them over conspiracies. In September, also, last week or the week before, time flies in this job. Over 20 states received packages with an unknown white substance in them. It is really concerning because last year the same situation happened, but the white powder in the packages was laced with fentanyl. In general, this is having a real effect on election workers. We've seen in the state of Colorado, 38% of election workers, of elected county clerks step down since 2020, in a large part because of the vitriol created by MAGA extremists. It's the MAGA strategy: spread disinformation, undermine faith in our elections, disenfranchise voters, and try to intimidate good Republicans and Democrats out of the positions of election workers, county clerks, secretaries of state, and election judges.
Certainly. And he knows what his words do. And, you've been subject to countless death threats. And if Donald Trump cared, he would denounce the people who make the threats on his behalf. Instead, he never. In fact, he calls the January 6 attackers patriots and honors them and pledges to pardon them, which is frightening to me. So getting back to the question about, like, you're the chair of Democratic Secretaries of State Association. What are you hearing from fellow Secretary of States about their concerns? I'm sure in different states there's different concerns, but are there some common things you're hearing?
Well, first off, I want to take a step back and look at 2022. In
Mhm.
last cycle, we had election deniers running in nearly every battleground state for Secretary of State. So picture going into the presidential election next month with people in charge of elections in battleground states who are MAGA election deniers who do not believe in free and fair elections. So a big step of protecting democracy was done in 2022 when the Democratic Association of Secretaries of State defeated every single election denier in a battleground state running for these jobs. We stopped these election deniers or helped stop them in Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. So first and foremost, we have good people in battleground states where we had races to stand up and defend the right to vote. You know, some of the common threads include the threat environment, the emergence of deep fakes, the litigation, the potential for what happens if Donald Trump loses. And I'm just so glad that we have people with backbones of steel in these positions in many of the key states. And for Colorado, I'm just so proud of my state and my office. I think, can safely say not only have some of the most accessible and secure elections in the nation, but I've been on it since 2020, making sure that we're closing any known loopholes for these election extremists. So in the last couple of years, I led the first in the nation law to make it a crime to be a fake elector or to try to steal the presidential election through fake elector schemes. We outlawed guns at the polls. I led the nation's first bill on insider threats, and I hope we get into that. But it's now a felony to compromise voting equipment here. We also passed laws to protect election workers, making it a crime to retaliate against them. And on top of that, I've rolled down millions of dollars to the counties so that they can beef up access and security, including in some counties. That means putting in bulletproof glass, which is a travesty in this nation. But we're ready to go. I think Democratic secretaries of state are across the nation are ready to go. And ultimately, through all the trepidation, through what Donald Trump and his allies will try, the American people will have the ability to save democracy. And it's coming to a point where it's in the American people's court. Are they going to make a plan to vote? And I really encourage your listeners, make a plan, start thinking about who you're going to cast your ballot for and how you're going to cast that ballot in a timely fashion to make sure your voice is heard and your vote is counted.
It's something we remind people all the time, to your point, Secretary, that if you haven't voted in a few years, make sure you haven't been purged. You know, if you've moved, make sure you register. And if you're in a red state, you know, they could have closed your voting location. They could have gotten rid of the mail-in ballots that you did in 2020 and 2022. So do the work now where you've got the time so you don't have to panic later. You know, we talk a lot about the violence or the specter of violence by Donald Trump's words, but also there's criminality that he's encouraged. And one is Tina Peters in your state, just sentenced to 9 years in prison for following Donald Trump's lies about the election. What can you share a little bit? She's in your state and an election official.
She was an election official.
Right.
So the Tina Peters case, she just received her sentencing yesterday. But to go back to 2021, she presented the nation's first insider threat when an election official, someone elected to execute local elections, county elections, actually compromised her own voting systems trying to prove the big lie. And at the time, imagine the nation had never seen this before, and suddenly we realized there's a security breach. I decertified all the voting equipment in that county. We worked with Republican county commissioners. Her county, I think, voted 65% for Donald Trump. So it's a conservative-leaning county. I worked with the Republican county commissioners to remove her from oversight of her election. And at the time, actually appointed my 2018 Republican opponent to take her place, former Republican Secretary of State Wayne Williams. But then we started to work with the local prosecutor, who also is a Republican, the district attorney, who decided to bring charges. So this case has been ongoing since 2021. Tina Peters was found in August guilty of 4 felonies and 3 misdemeanors and was sentenced to 9 years of incarceration yesterday. And if you're not to tell your viewers to go do more homework, but if you have a moment, listen to the judge's words in the sentencing, because he very clearly states how dangerous her actions were, both to her community, but to our democracy at large. He repeatedly called her a charlatan.
Mm-hmm.
He said that if she could do it again, she absolutely would. And I think, the judge words, the sentencing, the Republican district attorney's decision to bring the case, and my actions when this case, the situation initially emerged, send a really clear message to would-be folks who would think about compromising voting equipment. And that is, we will not tolerate any threat to Colorado's elections.
Absolutely. And could you tell people a little bit about, we don't have to go too detailed in, but she was involved in allowing an authorized person, later linked to Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, Trump's World, believing the big lie, and allowing people to get inside the system that they should not be allowed to, because that goes to the protection of our voting system, so that we believe in the system. So can you share a little bit about what Tina Peters did?
Absolutely. And this is a case, a situation that as it unfolded, if this was like a television show, a daytime television show, you would be like, the writers are so ridiculous. There is no way the situation could happen in real life.
Right.
But it started with, we picked up Mesa County, that's a county in Western Colorado, their election passwords online posted by the guy who allegedly leads QAnon. So we go in, investigate. At the time, there was a rock slide in the canyon leading to that county. So civil servants from my office jumped on the state plane. They fly out there. And I basically told them, you guys need to hold on the tarmac until you have attorneys go inside the county clerk's office with you. Because at the end of the day, I'm a Democratic Secretary of State, and we want the Republican county attorneys, the Republican district attorney, to go in with my civil servants.
Right.
So they go in, they examine the voting equipment and realize it was compromised. And what happened is Tina Peters was working with Mike Lindell, another billionaire out of Utah. They bring in someone in Mike Lindell's circle who was a former professional surfer. He poses as someone else. They steal or allegedly take someone's identity, and then they steal passwords from the civil servants on my staff and open up the voting equipment. So it was a series of things that should not happen. They just happened to badge in. We knew exactly who was in the room, when they were in the room, what they were doing. And then after the fact, Tina Peters admitted over and over and over to what she did. So not the best criminal mind out there. With that said, the county's elections were never at threat. We discovered the security breach months before any voting happened. And then we have protocols that happen. All the voting equipment is tested before it's used. Mm-hmm. So even if we had not discovered it when we did, my team or the election workers would have discovered the issue before voting. But the whole situation is just a travesty. To see someone elected to oversee elections really just turn her back on her duty. But at the end of the day, the saga has come to somewhat of a close, in that she faced accountability yesterday. And I hope it serves as a deterrent to people who would try to, get fame, political fame, through trying to undermine or threaten America's elections, because it can lead to real time in prison. And I think most people don't want to live 9 years of their lives incarcerated for some bozo thing they decided to do to launch their career.
And I appreciate that you shared in detail what had happened there, because people are seeing probably headlines, former election official, 9 years in jail. But she was a vocal supporter of Donald Trump. She believed the big lie. She was trying to help Donald Trump. Mike Lindell and his associates get involved. It's all the people that you could laugh at watching on cable news at times, but they're committing crimes for Donald Trump. And that concerns us. So from the lesson of Tina Peters and other things from 2020 and 2022, as Secretary of State, what have you learned, and what can you do to ensure people who are listening, even those on the right, that look, your vote's going to be counted. It's going to be fine. We're not going to let anyone play any games here.
Yeah. To your point, all of this compromising of voting equipment happened right before Mike Lindell hosted a big, he called it a cyber symposium.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he was going to prove to the world that Donald Trump actually won 2020 in part from the data that they were investigating in Mesa County, Colorado. So Tina Peters absolutely was trying to prove Trump's big lie, and it burned her. With that said, this happened in Colorado. Again, it was the first public insider threat. Subsequently, we discovered there have been other insider threats in other states, some of which look like they could be related. But I think a big takeaway that I would like Coloradans to hear, and folks from other states, is the fact that we discovered this issue shows how good our election system works in Colorado. We're considered the safest, the most accessible. We have a security procedure on top of security procedure where we're monitoring things like passwords. We're testing the voting equipment. There's bipartisan oversight over every step of the election process. And since we've had incidents like this, and since 2020, when we have realized how far some people on the far right are willing to go, we have tightened our laws even further. So Tina Peters was charged with those 4 felonies, but there was no laws on the book back in 2020 or 2021 that made it a straight out felony to compromise voting equipment. That's now in place.
Right.
We passed subsequent legislation that requires video monitoring of voting equipment every single day of the year, 24/7. Prior, it was just a couple months before and a couple months after the elections. We increased the physical security. Now everybody has to badge in. We rolled out millions of dollars to the counties to further increase their security and did whistleblower protections. But more than that, I think election officials across the nation are now keenly aware of what the threat environment looks like,
Right.
and have done, at least the Democrats, everything in their power to prepare for what happens in November. Again, the fact that the far right continues to lie, the fact that Donald Trump says he's going to come after election workers if he wins, the fact that he says that he can only lose if there is massive fraud that doesn't exist, shows that they're trying to inject chaos into November. But to an extent, I want the American people to realize how hard it is to run elections now, how ridiculous it is that I personally have received over 1,000 death threats or bodily harm threats in the last year for doing my job. But at the same time, to realize that there's this attempted instability of our elections, but it's because these folks are afraid of the American people's actions in November. And at the end of the day, your listeners and Americans all across this country have the ability to put a stop to this chaos, to this nonsense, and safeguard our democracy at the ballot box. And again, that means making a plan to vote, making sure you know what your election rules are, where your polling location is, because Dean, to your point, it could be different than it was in 2020.
Yeah.
And getting out, putting it in your calendar, making sure you know how you're going to cast that ballot, and making a plan to cast that ballot for the upcoming election.
I'm chatting with Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold. You really lay it out well for people, very practical, and also explain to people what the security and safeguards you've done. And I'm sure Secretary of States in other states, we've had Secretary of State Fontes on a few times, and Michigan Secretary of State on as well, and we'll continue talking with them. Last thing, I just want to get your reaction. Republicans in the House wanted to pass federal legislation, the SAFE Act, about not allowing people who are not citizens to vote. But that's the law already. Are we missing something? Isn't it already a crime if you're not a U.S. citizen to vote?
You're absolutely right. So it's already illegal to vote in a presidential election if you're not a citizen. And there's procedures set up, and in different states, they may look different in different states to make sure that only US citizens vote. At the end of the day, remember, the Speaker of the House is an election denier. He has spouted the ridiculous conspiracies, literally shoulder to shoulder with Donald Trump. And this was just another attempt to try to push out conspiracies. And, it's just flabbergasting, to tell you the truth. There are over 170 election deniers in Congress. There are election deniers now elected to all types of offices in this country. And the idea that they would swear on the Constitution to uphold the Constitution and protect this country, and then knowingly lie over and over and over to the American people is despicable. It truly is. It's important to make sure that if you hear something that sounds a little weird, like, hey, is that really a thing? To go to a trusted source for election information. There's all this disinformation from our foreign adversaries like China, Iran, Russia, but also domestic actors like the Speaker of the House. So go to a trusted source, your Secretary of State, your local county official. Make sure you get the correct information. And hopefully we will reach a point where MAGA Republicans realize it is not in their interest to continue to lie about elections. And the last thing I will say, Dean, is, we're talking, not the last thing I'll say on this topic. And if you want to talk more, I'm happy to talk more.
No, I appreciate it.
But I would just say, we're talking about Donald Trump's words leading to violence or threats to election workers. But the speaker's words also, every official who is in these positions where the American people should be able to trust them, who lies about elections, is creating an atmosphere where election officials, Republicans and Democrats, face threats to our lives, threats to our employees, threats to our families on a repeated basis. It is so un-American to behave like this. And I know it, without any consequence to an extent, implore them to stop. We know they're not going to stop because they haven't stopped for the last 4 years. But how irresponsible of them, how shameful of them. And the only people that they're hurting at the end of the day are their constituents.
Yeah, imagine instead of spending time spreading lies, they talked about policies that could help Americans with their lives, but they really don't have that. That's the truth. They have the so-called culture war issues, and then this stuff, and bigotry and racism, of course, which animates another subset of their base. If they'd spent all the time on lies, talking about how to help the American people, they could actually win elections on policy. But that's not what they're interested in. Very last thing I want to ask you. I mean, my concern thinking about Donald Trump in 2020 was, on the night of the election, he was leading because day of ballots were getting cast first, and he was yelling, "Stop the count." And after January 6th, my concern is if he does the same stop the count thing, you might see violence visited upon voting locations in battleground counties and in battleground states. Is that something that's on the radar of concern? And do Secretary of State that you speak to, are they taking the steps they need, working with the governor to ensure that that's protected?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, this question is a good question to dissect, because on one hand, if there are real threats of violence, we need to take them seriously. On the other hand, if there is just this overarching concern, we don't want to scare the American people into not voting. Right? So I would say, Colorado is a really good example. Back in 2020, we had an incident of 2 men in military fatigues open carrying close to a drop box in a pretty diverse neighborhood. And from my perspective, I thought that was illegal voter intimidation. It's illegal to intimidate a voter. We contacted law enforcement. The law enforcement in the area said, nope, this is not intimidating behavior to a voter. So from my perspective, I'm like, okay, well, let me make this very, very clear. This is voter intimidation. And I went and passed a law to make it illegal to open carry or concealed carry close to a drop box, a polling location, or where ballots are being processed. So I would just say our laws are much tighter in a lot of states. We cannot allow fear to hold us back.
Right.
Uh, I don't want to undermine or belittle the very real concerns. Trust me. There are real threats of political violence in
Mm-hmm.
this country. And again, I've been on the receiving end of it, and it's not pleasant at all. It's not a pleasant experience to have to live with people telling you over and over and over how they're going to kill you. But I would just say, I won't be intimidated. I have not been intimidated this entire last 4 years for doing what's right. And we cannot allow fear to hold us back from voting. I'm confident we're going to have good elections across this country. And if there are issues, whether it's, and by the way, there's always small issues in elections,
Sure.
many of which are just par for the course. Ballots get addressed to the wrong location for a couple thousand voters. That gets fixed. Things happen that secretaries of state will immediately respond to. But we have to make sure that everybody is ready to go, and we cannot allow the MAGA agenda of creating fear and chaos to win. At the
I
end of the day, there's really good Republicans who will stand up for our democracy all across this country. They're your neighbors, they're your local officials, they might be in your state house. But this isn't a Republican versus Democrat. This is extremist versus American. And we need Americans of good faith, of good heart to get out and vote. That might not mean voting only for Democrats, but making sure that we're not electing more extremists to local, state, and national office.
And very last thing, Secretary, the stakes of this election, have they ever been higher in your lifetime? And that what we're confronted with the two different stark views of government and society that's pitted by MAGA versus Vice President Harris and the Democrats?
I don't think we've ever had a major party nominee that poses such a threat as Donald Trump. He makes it very clear that he will do anything to grab onto power. And I'll tell you, Dean, I was very lucky to just welcome our newborn baby 6 weeks ago into
Ah,
this world with my husband.
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we have a little newborn boy. He's doing well, nice and healthy, eating a lot.
That's great.
Yeah. But being pregnant post Roe, being pregnant while extremists try to roll back it, and not just try to,
Right.
actually succeed in rolling back access to women for us to decide the future of our lives, criminalizing abortion, going after women, going after doctors, and even going after fertility treatments is an assault on American women. And I think just seeing everything that we've seen from the far right from the last couple of years, we need to make sure we're safeguarding our democracy, because that's how we safeguard our fundamental freedoms in this country. So it is
Absolutely.
imperative that we get out the vote in November.
Well, Secretary, again, congratulations on the baby. And
Thank
thank you for
you.
spending a lot of time with us, breaking it down and making us feel a little bit better. Everyone who had any concerns about voting, not really us on our side, but some people on the right listen, and I want them to feel like their vote's going to matter. This is what our democracy is about. And if your vote doesn't matter, that's what makes people do things sometimes that are illegal, to be honest, if not worse. So, Secretary Griswold, it was great chatting with you. I look forward to chatting with you in the future.
Thank you, Dean. Thanks for having me on.